Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare and Company. We're thrilled tonight to host a conversation between two writers, both of whose work has always stubbornly defied categorization, whose imaginative gymnastics have ceaselessly impressed and astonished, and whose unsentimental yet deeply humanistic books have repeatedly reminded readers around the world that the universe is far more complex and far more surprising than we could ever know. Michael Moorcock and Hari Kunzru. But you haven't come here to listen to me speak, so I'll hand over to Hari to introduce Michael and the event. I would like to add, though, before I do, that it's a pleasure and an honour for us to welcome you both to Shakespeare and Company this evening. And on a personal note, I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since Hari mentioned the idea in June last year, and I think it's going to be really quite something. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Hari Kunzru and Michael Moorcock to Shakespeare and Company.
Hello, everybody. So I'm supposed to do an introduction to Michael, which is almost impossible, I think, he has one of the most extraordinary and wide-ranging careers of, I think, any writer I've ever met, and I have met several. I'd like to congratulate him, actually, on making it into the store, because you, once upon a time, started off busking outside and have finally been allowed through the door. Wait,
yes.
Do you remember roughly what year were you making your money busking outside?
It was from. Oh, sorry, what was that?
That's a ghostly presence of my novel actually falling on your head. So let's. It's actually a copy of my novel. That's hilarious.
I think it's 1958. I used to, the shop was then called Mistral before it became the more famous Shakespeare and Company. Was
that a solo busking effort, or were you with
I used to busk
with a band?
With an American friend called Ray Nelson who lived here at the time.
Do you remember anything about your repertoire?
Blues mostly. I mean, it would be mostly blues and kind of that sort of thing. When I did it for tourists, I took over a gig from a lady in Montmartre for a while, and I used to have to sing Clementine a lot, because that's what the tourists liked, and they used to sort of clap along to it and sing along to it and so on. Yeah, that's what
pleasing the crowds.
Yeah, but we didn't do that much outside. We mostly just, we were just, busking, having a good time, and sometimes people would throw a bit of money into a hat.
You'd get a drink out of it. Or...
Oh, well, no, we wouldn't get a drink. We'd get a book, because George let us do it. I'm sure, because he knew we were spending every penny we made outside, inside, and I actually bought my first ever modern science fiction book in. Here.
So do you remember what that was?
It was what sort of made me interested in I wasn't interested. Yeah, it was. I do. It's still the best science fiction book I ever read. Stars My Destination by Alfred Bester. Tiger in England, where it was first published. It was first published in England.
All right.
It's Tiger in England, which was his preferred title, but the publisher didn't like that because it wasn't science fiction enough in America, so they turned it to Stars My Destination.
So in between 1958 and now, several things have happened, and among them, Mike started his career maybe younger than virtually any other writer I've come across. As a teenager, you were already working as a writer, writing and editing Tarzan stories and various other genre stories for British magazine publishers. He went on through the 1960s to become the leading light in the new wave of science fiction, which the kind of vast simplification would be the turn from outer space to inner space, the interest in psychology, the interest in altered states of consciousness, and you were very, very important in bringing the ideas of what was then called the counterculture into the world of science fiction, which at that point was, I suppose it's fair to say, the preserve of gentlemen with sports jackets and slide rules. And during your career, you've published. I suppose to be addressing you rather than Mike. During his career,
I was interested.
Really? Do you think he sounded like a good fellow?
Yeah, sounds all right.
I mean, he as a working writer, and this is one of the many reasons I admire Mike so much, is that he has really he understands the spectrum of what it means to be a writer, from the world of literary prizes and weighty hardcovers and the monthly reviews, through to the kind of Grub Street end of writing, where with quick turnarounds and writing to word counts. I mean,
I think working as a hack is being a hack.
I think that's a very honourable thing. I mean, I blew a couple of minds in my undergraduate. I teach an undergraduate class for NYU here in Paris, and when I told them that Mike sometimes managed 15,000 words a day, and that there are novels that he wrote in a total of 3 days, that was not how you're taught to do it on an MFA. Today we're going to focus on Jerry Cornelius, who is one of Mike's most beloved creations, and who is a sort of time-traveling, shape-shifting dandy who over the years has occupied all sorts of spaces and bodies, and most recently seems to have become very engaged in, as he's always engaged in the matters of the moment, and these days he is finding himself concerned with what seems to be called the age of Trump. I hope it's not an age. I hope it's more like it seems like a bloody age, doesn't it? It's all right. And I know Mike doesn't want to read a lot, but I think we could start off by just having a little taste of Jerry in one of his more recent incarnations.
It's hard to read these books out of context, I think. So I'm just going to read from the start of the most recent one, which is called Pegging the President. I don't know how many of you know what pegging is, but I'm not going to explain it here. There being ladies present and actually gentlemen present too. I mean, all sorts of people present. I didn't really want to know, but I do now know what it means. I haven't got my glasses, so I'm just staring at this vacantly.
Might not be any good to you.
No, sorry, I realised why. Yeah, here we are. The Cornelius stories don't so much rely on quotations, but they have a lot of quotations in them, which are usually put in for ironic purposes rather than for I don't know, any other kind of purpose. I'm not going to read one of those, but it's a good way of pinching a lot of other people's writing and then getting paid for it in the form of a book. But anyway, these are regular characters who it's the Cornelius stories depend on a sort of repertory of characters, and in a way, I use the Commedia dell'arte as an example. They tend to represent the same things, the same kind of areas or same kind of character, although they are their own characters in every book. So the more of these that you read, the more you begin to get some, I suppose it gives some sort of weight to the others, or not. I mean, you anyway, so I'm just going to start reading at the beginning without the quotes from Pegging the President. I've just got to see who's speaking. Oh, God. Right. I've been through 4 world wars in the same bloody tank type, Mr. C. Look at it. My Uncle Alf went through 2 in 3. Is that fair? Holding a rag, Shaky Mo Collier popped his filthy head through the top of the Sherman's conning tower. Don't worry, Chief. Once we start rolling, I'll have us there in a Mississippi minute. Sunrise, and they were rehearsing again. This was the most boring bit of the movie business. Mist twisting up from the wide river, making ghosts rise in the early light and hang there, discreet spectators. Far away, naval guns continued their assault on the city's defences under Emily Z., the Maid of New Orleans. At the far end, on the grey metal road bridge's eastern side, white border guards appeared. They were just up and breakfasted at Paw Paw's hospitality hut on the eastern side. Its inviting neon still winked on and off against the lightening sky. Mo was impressed. This was the largest Paw Paw's he had seen since Houston. Hoping to reach Jackson, Jerry and Mo had followed the coast road until it petered out at Biloxi. Then they headed inland. An Egyptian gambler in Préjean's Baton Rouge had suggested they cross at Vicksburg, where the Mississippi narrowed. He had said to tell any authorities, if questioned, that they were under the eye of al-Misrani. Borders were still relatively stable on the Mississippi side. Their freshly polished kit and badges blazing in the morning sun, their lips bright with Paw Paw's grease and sugar, the young guards cheerfully began waving private cars through. Not his turn yet, but Mo slid back to his controls, slamming the lid behind him. Trucks and tanks would be inspected after civilian armoured cars. Jerry settled down to smoke a Sullivan's and took his pleasure, watching the old F-111 4s graze lazy trails in the light sky. A flash of gold at Angels 1-4 and a couple of Chinese FTS Mao So Eleganti fighters came twisting into focus. Flying at angles and coming out of the sun, they were almost invisible. They were a dying breed. Jerry admired that perfect combination of Italian engineering and Chinese aesthetic. Jesus! On the ground, the border guards glanced away. Jerry couldn't blame them for their embarrassment. The US planes were hopelessly clunky. They looked like bad Kirby copies. 20th century styling at its heavy Macomec worst. That's what the art critics complained about in New York, even though the money had all gone to Warsaw. He sighed. The big swing wings had enjoyed a period of fashion in the 60s and 70s, had made a short comeback during the noughties. By the time Bush Minor announced victory over the Middle East, they were being sold to cocaine republics for a song. Their chattering, over-based ordnance was erratic as usual. They were barely holding their shape as 3D printed parts melted or caught fire. All's the trouble with knockoffs. He had never fathomed why people only trusted Russian drones these days. Maybe he was a snob, but Jerry really believed you got more than just a brand if you bought the real thing from Israel. And when it came to vehicle design, the Chinese could not be imitated or improved upon. Jerry sucked in chilly air. How had it come to this? Once US weapons were the world's standard. They set the tone. They were supremely romantic, beautifully engineered, perfectly mass-produced. They had simple, interchangeable parts. Now it was all Israel this and North Korea that. Who had not at some time wanted a Winchester, a Remington, Sharps, or a Henry, an Adams, and especially a Colt? US weaponry carried the authority of practical instruments made for practical pioneering people, for branding pards like Maestros, Smith & Wesson. I've got a feeling it's not all here, or failing that is...
You missed a bit out.
Yeah, I think it's a terrible bit of writing.
I don't think so. I think we could,
is it all right?
if you're having sadness,
okay,
reading, we could do some talking.
Right, we will. I'll just finish this paragraph. Their simple but reliable wares were quick to clean, easy to loan. Now it was all Uzis and Glocks. Nothing worked until you had charged it. A multitude of safeties, and they cost a fortune. These days, most of the mortgages on US houses came from banks in Eritrea. Okay, sorry, that wasn't a very good bit of reading, but it's been read.
Au contraire. Not okay. So we're in a world that is in some ways familiar to us here, but in other ways it's really not. We're kind of inching out into understanding what reality we're in, which is often the case in one of these Cornelius stories. We're often dropped into the middle of a situation which is a sort of refracted version of something we might be familiar with. I mean, this is a world where there's some kind of border and the Mississippi. But as you said in your introduction, these new worlds are populated by kind of archetypes who we're familiar with, or we may be familiar with from across many books in different places. But one of the constants of Jerry is that he's always an aesthete. It's a very Jerry thing to be interested in the aesthetics of fighter jets.
It's the only reason he does it is because it's either pretty or elegant or suits his
he's got a lineage. I mean, he's also himself a refraction of other heroes in other parts of your work. But could you give us a sense of where Jerry comes from?
Well, I wanted to write. This is when I first started writing. Really, I wanted to create a character and a kind of writing which captured the mythic present. So I actually, I think I described him in the first book as Messiah to the Age of Science, which was probably a bit hopeful, but I also wanted to write. Initially, most of these stories were set in London, and I wanted to write about the kind of mythic sense of London, the sense of myth that I had about London. So I'm trying to deal with present-day reality, but in terms of its myths rather than in terms of its nuts and bolts day-to-day.
I mean, Jerry's a creature of a very particular part of London, of Notting Hill. Yeah. You say a little bit about what Notting Hill means to you and to your work more generally.
When I was sort of wondering about doing this, as I tended to in those days, and still didn't really know, I was sitting in a little cafe in Notting Hill, and just where it starts, where Portobello Road starts, and I saw this really elegant youth coming towards me with sort of long hair and very sort of sharp, nice-looking clothes. This is pre-Carnaby Street. It was about 64, something like that, 5. And behind him was I also saw the name of a local greengrocer, which is probably gone by now, but it's called Cornelius of London, and it was pretty much a godsend. Went straight into my lap, and I wanted a name too that wasn't necessarily associated with England particularly, with English anyway. I wanted a sort of a European name, and Cornelius seemed to go across quite a lot of Europe, so suited me.
I mean, there is a tradition of English cosmopolitanism which is being thoroughly squashed at the moment, and is a tradition for which you've always stood, a kind of openness and a creativity. I mean, the lazy thing is always to identify Englishness with, stodgy puddings and Nigel Farage and that kind of thing, but that's absolutely not the case. There's always been a dandyism, a flamboyance, and a flair. And Jerry Cornelius is that's one of the things he's an archetype of.
It's probably more Oscar Wilde than Kingsley Amos.
That's very true. But I mean, you bring up Kingsley Amos, and I know that you have a fondness in general for sort of forgotten, slightly not that Amos especially forgotten, but for let's say unfashionable strands of English writing as well. You mentioned the other night that when you need to kind of recalibrate yourself after let's say a lot of Edgar Rice Burroughs, you might go to Angus Wilson, who won't be a familiar name to everybody.
Well, I liked Angus a lot. I mean, he was a friend. He was also, I think, a brilliant writer and somebody who's now pretty much forgotten in modern English letters, as far as I can tell. I mean, it's amazing to me.
I think he's barely read at all at the moment.
And he's a very good writer. I mean, he's sort of up there with, like, at his best, he's up there with people like Henry Green and who's another, of course, now obscure English writer.
Green's having a moment in
Yes.
the New York Review reissue project of Henry Green. So suddenly there are people on the subway in Brooklyn reading Henry Green, which is amusing to me.
That's great. Yeah, but it's good though. I mean, he's a very good writer and deserves to be, I don't know, read.
I mean, and another counter tradition that you're part of, and which you've always written out of. Well, I mean, at one point in Firing in the Cathedral, which is the other relatively recent Cornelius book, the one with a sort of redder cover. There's one of these books' preoccupations is reality and the shifting nature of reality, and everybody, these archetypal characters are moving through very unstable worlds. And at one point Jerry's trying to explain this to somebody, and he says there's the reality shift, the world has turned upside down. And now that's a little phrase that will spark an association with anybody who thinks about the English Civil War. And I mean, it's a reference to a pamphlet whose full fantastic title is The World Turned Upside Down, or A Brief Description of the Ridiculous Fashions of These Distracted Times, by T.J., a well-wisher to King, Parliament and Kingdom. And that's a 1640s political pamphlet. And you write out of that English tradition of... I mean, from below of cocking a snook at the king and of
from
class
being an
system.
outsider, I think, is when I first started writing science fiction, you were a literary outsider. There's no doubt about it. You had to explain yourself. You had to, and people were often very condescending, kindly condescending. And I used to get invited to universities as if from the...
You were the specimen, were you? You were the Trobriand Islander or something.
But they also wanted to know, where my vitality came from. And also...
They are a happy people.
Yes. Yes. But also, they made more money than most literary writers, which was another thing that they were always academics were always interested in.
Academics are always obsessed with money. There's a truth about academics.
And so they thought, maybe they could do it too. Maybe there's a way, you could get away with it. You could do it and not be an outsider, because of course they didn't want to be outsiders. I tended to position myself on the outside every chance I got. Every time I got offered a chance to join, I don't know, the Royal Literary Society or whatever it was, I would back off or say something rude. When I was younger, I'm much nicer now. As I explained to my grandchildren.
So you'll be accepting the knighthood when the letter comes.
No, I won't. I won't go that far. I liked J.G. Ballard, who's one of the people involved with this revolution, if you like, that we were doing. Who said that he was offered a CBE, which is the commander of the British Empire, and he said he'd take it if he could call himself Commander Ballard. And he turned it down. I mean, there's quite a good tradition of people turning down.
I mean, you're outside in this. I mean, you're being, as is your wont, quite self-deprecating. But your sense of the sort of political dimensions of being an outsider is a little stronger than I think you're making out. One anecdote that I'd love you to repeat, because you told it to me and it sort of blew my tiny mind, was the time as a teenager when you went undercover at a sort of fascist tea party as part of on behalf of an anarchist group of which you were a member.
Yeah, I was a member of the West London Anti-Fascist Youth Committee. This is in the 50s. About 57, I know exactly when it was, and there was the precursors of the National Front, the English National Front, who were a straight fascist outfit, was called Arnold Leese's Information for the Jew-Wise, I think it was called.
Catchy.
And Arnold Leese was the man who'd called Oswald Mosley a kosher fascist. He thought that Mosley wasn't a very good fascist at all, not nearly sort of firm enough.
The boots weren't shiny enough.
Absolutely, and not enough people hated. You know, he didn't. I joined. I was part of this, and we all, most of us, joined the Arnold Leese's outfit. By this time, Arnold Leese was dead, but his widow was running it, running a publication called Black and White, which in Notting Hill in those days, you can imagine what that was all about. And she was a kindly old lady, a little white-haired old lady with, classic little white-haired old lady, very pleasant. And she'd say to us, "Come in, boys, come in. Sit down." We'd sit down at her table in the back room behind the shop, which was selling records of Hitler's speeches.
So they actually had a shop front
in
1950s Notting Hill.
I think they probably stopped having a shop front after it had been damaged a few times.
For context, for people who don't know, 1950s Notting Hill was an area where a lot of West Indians came to live. So that was an extremely provocative act. To make that.
They're a bit closer to the Holland Park end of
that makes all the difference.
Of Princedale Road. Well, it did make a difference. It was the posher end, and they didn't get so much movement, whatever. I don't know there. Yeah. But anyway, she'd sit there and tell us all about how we should watch out for what the Jews were up to and how the blacks were going to rape all our women. I mean, it sounded very much like Donald Trump, it's the same stuff.
And as far as she was concerned, you were the flower of white youth.
We were, yes. We were all very white, very pink, and very young and blonde. I think there wasn't a single... one of us was Scottish, but she didn't seem to mind that. She'd instruct us in the ways of being good fascists. But it turned out that she was the only fascist. Pretty much everybody there, as in The Man Who Was Thursday, was an infiltrator, either a communist or a member of our outfit.
You were never a sort of sectarian leftist or anything like that, but. Well, or were you? Are you going to reveal your membership of...
I did join the Labour Party for a while. I actually joined the Liberal Party, but that was to get a job, so it doesn't really count. I worked for them for a short while, writing pamphlets. I was writing speeches and stuff for the poor old Liberals.
How did you have the time? I have no idea that you did that.
They fired me in the end. Because I explained to them very, very clearly that I couldn't afford to work for them. I had to have another job. So I was having to go to Fleet Street to get commissions of various kinds, and work for them. But they weren't paying me enough for me to be able to support myself, let alone a family. So they fired me one Christmas, which I thought was pretty good. Yeah, pretty liberal. I wrote. I used to have to go to the Conservative office to get their pamphlets, and then to the Labour office to get their pamphlets. Then I'd take the best bits out of them and rewrite them as liberal policy, because they said we didn't have any policy, and that was, wasn't fair.
Somehow it's very professional of you. And it also seems like very, very typical in a certain way. You mentioned not being a joiner, being a kind of sort of instinctive recoiler from groups and gangs, but you sort of always stood at the intersection of lots of different currents.
Well, I had a family that was very strange, very, very strange for an English family in those days. Not so different, say, for an American family. My grandmother had a lot of kids, and they spread across. My uncle, my oldest uncle, was Winston Churchill's secretary. He lived at Downing Street, so I'd go and visit him in Downing Street. And in those days there wasn't all the bars and everything in front of Downing Street. It was just one policeman, and I'd go up and and the policeman would look down and say, "What do you want, sonny?" And this is when I was little. I'd take the bus up to Downing Street, and during the school holidays, without telling anybody. I mean, I just turned up at Downing Street, and I'd say, well, I've come to see my uncle. And, who's your uncle? So eventually, I said who my uncle was, Jack Taylor. Oh, yes, it's Taylor. Yes. And they'd sort of send for him, and he'd come out in his kind of posh pinstripes, as it were, and send the policeman off to buy buns for tea. And so the place was completely unguarded, as it were, at that point. And the policeman would come back with a little bag of currant buns. Yeah, what the boys like, that sort of thing, because he had no children of his own. And my other relatives, one of his brothers bred dogs for a living in southeast London. Another one was a telephone engineer. I mean, they covered a very wide spectrum of classes, and so I had experience of pretty much every class.
I mean, that is an unusual experience for a British person of your generation. Yeah. I mean, most people were very trapped within the outlook of their particular class. And so, I mean, that mobility, that sort of restlessness seems to go all through your work somehow.
I guess so. It also made me very easy with all different classes of people, I think. I mean, it just made it very, I had no trouble moving through the class system, except for my accent, which I couldn't exactly turn into Cockney without sounding ridiculous. But apart from that, it was the experience was, I think, wonderful.
I mean, so later on, you had friends within this sort of hippie West London music scene, and then you had sort of a professional standing within the science fiction community. And you also seem to have kind of contacts with sort of more avant-garde and kind of beat tendencies.
It's sort of where I happened to be living. I'd moved to Notting Hill the way people always do move to places, because it was cheap, and so it picked up a lot of writers, musicians, artists, people who started there because they didn't have much money. By the mid-60s, there were it really felt as if you needed to play a fretted instrument to be able to live there. I mean, you couldn't. There were so many,
which you did,
which I did. Yeah. Yes. Well, I'd done before. I was very lucky in that I hit the moment when rock and roll really started to get going, and when science fiction started to get going. And they were very similar in some ways, because they were both frowned on by the establishment. It's hard to remember that now, but rock and roll really was frowned on, dismissed completely. Science fiction was dismissed in the same way. And it meant that they were two fields completely open to you. You could, anything you wanted to do, you could try out, and people would be glad to let you try, because nobody knew if there were any rules to these things.
I mean, that's very much how the sort of legend of 60s London has been sold to people of my generation, is that there was that moment of openness, and that there was, a cat can look at a king, and that anybody can invent themselves, suddenly across these class lines, which had previously been so rigid. And then seems that subsequently that rigidity has re-established itself.
Thatcher. I mean, almost the day Thatcher was elected, and I remember being in Harrods, and some horrible young what do they used to be called, Chelsea something or others,
Sloane Rangers,
that's it. They were in Harrods, and they were suddenly being incredibly rude. Linda was with me, my American wife. We'd just recently been together, and she was sort of horrified at the way I didn't attack them physically, these young women, but they were being very rude, not to me, but to other people in the store. And I just went for them, and I told them they were being rude, and they shouldn't be. And they looked at me with the disdain one always saves the seriously insane, and went about their way buying the store. And it did seem really, one day you were speaking the language of liberalism, and that was the common, the if you like, the common language of educated people. And then suddenly you were talking Thatcherism, and it was as if they'd just been waiting to come back and make everything all right again.
And I mean, in literary terms, there's a lot of boundaries got broken down as well. I mean, I think writers of my sort of generation, several of whom I know are fans of yours. We're quite unselfconscious about bringing what are sort of known as genre elements into our work that is then sort of sold as literary work. But I mean, can you give us a sense of quite how rigid those boundaries were?
Well, they were so rigid that people like Angus Wilson, who had actually bought Tiger, the book that the Bester book, which started me reading modern science fiction. He was a science fiction fan, and
as was Kingsley Amos, wasn't
he? Yeah,
he?
Kingsley Amos. Very different, though. I mean, well, fair enough, but yes, they both were. Almost everybody was, and what they liked then was jazz. They liked jazz and science fiction and sports jackets, as you pointed out. And they all seemed to wear, apart from Angus Wilson, they all seemed to wear, baggy flannels and those sports jackets with things on the elbows, the patches on the elbows. And they were very, they actually, those people, it was previous generation to mine, were actually sort of, they were promoting it, but promoting it in a way that kept it very isolated as something, you looked at but didn't actually participate in much. I mean, Amos didn't really write very much. He wrote one good science fiction novel, I think. But there was an embarrassment about it, distinctly. And if you had to explain yourself, usually in ridiculous literary terms, you couldn't. I mean, the other thing was there was no such thing as fantasy. It didn't exist as a phrase, as a term for describing a book.
But people were reading Lord of the Rings or whatever.
Lord of the Rings.
What did they call that?
They called it. The first people who read Lord of the Rings in the 50s, which I think was 56. They came out 55, 56, 57, something like that. The 3 volumes. They tried to explain it as a post-nuclear Holocaust story, the same as Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast, exactly the same. They could only describe it in those terms. They could not get their heads around it as being...
even though Tolkien was clearly drawing on this kind of canon of Icelandic sagas
Absolutely.
and Anglo-Saxon literature and
nonetheless,
medieval
the
fantasy.
world that he had created was post-nuclear Holocaust. I'm sure if you went back and looked at the reviews, you'd see what...
I never understood that.
Yeah. So it wasn't until it got to America as a pirated book. A friend of mine actually pirated it, a publisher called Donald A. Wollheim, who was a terrible man in some ways, last Stalinist in New York that I know of, and he wanted the books to be published. He loved them, but they wouldn't let him have them because they looked down on paperback publishing, any kind of paperback publishing. American paperback publishing was even more disgusting than English paperback publishing. I mean, this went down a whole range. And I knew the people who were refusing to have their books published in America in paperback
because it was so déclassé.
Yes, absolutely. So Tolkien wouldn't have any of it. Wouldn't allow it to be published in the States. So Wollheim took the things, put them in very flashy ace paperback covers in his science fiction series, and gave them to the American public, which was mostly, of course, a university public at that point. They all took it up, they loved it, and that's how it became.
So you get Gandalf for president buttons.
Yes, all that stuff.
I mean, let's not go too far down the Tolkien. You are not known as a supporter of Tolkien.
But I'm a great Peake fan, and Peake had exactly the same treatment. Peake, as you know, is a very good artist. The Americans, when they took them, this is sometime after the Lord of the Rings, insisted on putting their own kind of bizarre covers on them. They wouldn't put Peake's covers on them because they weren't commercial enough. I mean, it was so you're dealing with that all the time. People associated imaginative fiction, or almost all imaginative fiction, as being in the margins, and science fiction being, as far away in the margins as you could get.
But I mean, it seems that America was more receptive to this boundary crossing work maybe than
No,
Britain.
they weren't.
No.
They still aren't, actually. There's still more snobbery in as you, I'm sure, know.
Outside the pages of the Times book review, perhaps.
Well,
but
yeah.
I was trying to set myself up to confirm something with you that you said to me. Is that you said at one point that you held a party at which you introduced Arthur C. Clarke to William Burroughs.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Did they get on?
Yes, very well indeed. The only thing that they did keep asking to have the music turned down, because neither of them liked rock and roll. But
that was
no, they had a whole lot of things in common. Honestly, I mean, it was amazing. I mean, it turns out that this is my proud boast that I'd introduced Arthur to Bill Burroughs, but in fact it turned out they had met briefly at the Chelsea Hotel a few months earlier. So it wasn't so strange as I thought it was at the time.
I'm aware we're running short of time, but before I open it up to some questions from the audience, I'd just like to say let's not be completely nostalgic and say what are you working on now?
Well, one of the things I've always done is try to expand my range as a writer. Just try to do things that I haven't done before, or that haven't been done before. And so I'm writing at the moment. It's a very peculiar thing. I've just finished the second volume. It's true autobiography. I mean, absolutely exact, non-fictionalized autobiography, but blended with pure, outright, fantastic adventure. So that's the two things together, and trying to make them work.
And Mother London is a very beloved, more recent book of yours, and and has elements of both those things in it.
Yes.
So, but you're saying there's sort of clear blue water between the two strands.
I think there are. I mean, I've never seen that degree of realism, and it's conscientious realism. I'm really trying to be as exact as I can be, combined with full-fledged imaginative fiction. And I mean, I've done my best with it. It seems, the readers, or some readers at any rate, seem to be happy with it. So,
and with that, do we have any questions from the audience? Otherwise, I'm very happy to carry on talking forever.
Thanks. First of all, thank you for being here. Always nice to hear you too. I have a question for you. As an editor, you some time ago you were very prone to claim the influence of William Burroughs on, let's say, science fiction and the British New Wave, and especially ballad, obviously. And I wanted to know if he was any influence on, if he had any influence on your writing personally.
He was an inspiration, I think, to me and ballad. I mean, I first read Burroughs here in Olympia press editions, and I took those to England. And thanks. And ballad. We were very good friends, and he became interested in it too. But neither of us was particularly was particularly influenced by Burroughs. but he showed you that it could be done. And I think that was why we were so enthusiastic. Both of us wrote about him. I wrote about him in the famous UGG controversy in the TLS, where various old establishment writers said what a disgusting, useless writer he was, and people like me said what a brilliant writer he was. Probably pointless, but that's what we did. Yeah, I mean, but he was a great inspiration. Yes.
Thank you. You've mentioned Kingsley Amos a couple of times. As I recall, back in the 60s, he published a book, New Maps of Hell, which was a literary criticism of science fiction, but I was wondering if you have any recollection of how the book was received at that time.
It was received very well. It was a promotion of science fiction, but of a very narrow range of science fiction. He'd got most of the books that he did his research on, he'd got from one publisher who published a particular kind of writer. And
which was?
I was going to say, who he perceived as being satirical writers, and they claimed not to be. And that I didn't think it was a particularly good book, but it was an enthusiastic book. He made no bones about liking it, liking science fiction, but it was that particular. I think again he had to justify it to a literary public. He had to explain it to people. So it was the easiest thing to do was to take the satirical element in science fiction. Novels like The Space Merchants by Pohl and Kornbluth, which satirized the advertising industry of the time. Books of that kind, which took a particular element in modern America, mostly American society, and then sort of blew it up and extended it into the future. It wasn't science fiction that I was particularly interested in myself. I was interested in I was interested in the imaginative elements, and I felt sometimes that the so-called serious elements actually worked against it, because it meant that this happened with H.G. Wells, for instance. He started off as a very intensely imaginative writer, and gradually became more and more a writer, giving his opinions about things rather than writing what his imagination suggested he write. Difference between The Time Machine and something like Men Like Gods, which is only about 20 years, I think, but he took himself too seriously, and in a way, I think that's why Amos was taking those particular writers. I disagreed with him, but then I disagreed with him. I mean, we didn't like one another at all. I mean, really. One of the times we were going to a wedding to a mutual friend in Oxford, and we met him on the station. I said, "Oh, hello, Kingsley," and he said, "Hello," and I said, "Oh, we're going down to this wedding together," and he said, "Oh, are we? Yes." I mean, he was extremely haughty. His wife was very, very nice. I mean, she was always trying to make up for his rudeness. And then he said, "Well, we're going first, so I suppose we won't see you till we're down there." And I think that's probably the last exchange.
Didn't at some point you then get edited by his son at the New Statesman?
No, yeah. I mean, Martin was fine. I mean, I had no problems with Martin. Nobody ever had any problems with Martin. He was very nice kid. And also a very good editor, a very conscientious editor at the New Statesman, literary editor. He got me to do the first review of Star Wars, which so hated it. My review so hated the film that he had to get another another review. He published mine,
second opinion.
But he had to publish somebody else's as well. He was okay, Martin. He got more and more like his father, which was a shame. He got more pompous, as he went on.
I'm saying nothing.
Well, okay.
Any more questions.
I actually snubbed him in Saint Malo by accident the last time I saw him. He's so short. He's very hard to see.
You're quite tall.
Yes.
I mean, that's, you know.
And Linda said, "Didn't you see that was Martin Amos just went past?" I said, "Oh, I didn't mean to be rude to him, but but I did."
Adam, please tell us this isn't being recorded or something. Okay.
He also.
There's somebody at the back there who does have a question.
I had a good bit of gossip still.
We're descending, I can
yes,
tell.
Yes, I love gossip much more than. Sorry, who?
I'm unfamiliar with your work. Which piece would you suggest I start reading, Michael Moorcock?
I'm sorry. It depends what you like to read. I've written such a wide variety of work. Some of it's, as it were, straight literary fiction, and some of it is science fiction, or fantasy, really, science fantasy. If you like fantasy, then probably you could start with The Eternal Champion, which is probably the worst book I ever wrote, but it is a good starter. If you don't,
I could dive in.
It's okay, you dive in.
I mean, the gateway drug for the fantasy stuff that I like to offer people is a trilogy called The Dancers at the End of Time, which takes place at the end of time and is filled with kind of decadence and a kind of crushed velvet and patchouli atmosphere, and is a sort of love story between a very straight-laced, time-traveling late Victorian woman and a denizen of the end of time who knows nothing about morality. And if your taste is towards the more straight literary fiction, I'd say Mother London is a very wonderful novel, kind of filled with a sense of the city. I think it's fair to say you're a city writer. You seem to me very much against the sort of pastoral Tolkienish tradition of fantasy, and very much in a tradition of busyness and ambiguity and bustle. Yeah,
absolutely. Yes, I'd say Mother London. If you don't want to read, but Dance at the End of Time, I think, is a good one. It riffs off the aesthetes, really, in the late 19th century, early 20th century English aesthetics. So good luck.
Good evening.
It's a long book, so I was trying to think of a short book that wouldn't cost you so much.
The Shakespeare and Company, they can handle length.
Okay, all right. Yeah, Behold the Man. People that's a good cross, really. Yeah, thanks, Sean. And it's available in French as well as English.
Can't get in. In Daughter of Dreams, you use the expression, the triumph of bigotry. Was that precedent, or did it succeed your political involvement? And has anything changed in the context of the EU referendum in the UK?
Not at all. Nothing whatsoever. No, thanks. No, I think the bigotry is still winning at the moment. Very, very much. What can I say? Probably very few people here are strong supporters of Trump or Trumpism, and probably not too many people are Brexit supporters. I'm certainly not, and I think that is all. It's reaction, though. I think more than bigotry as such. There's a lot of bigotry in it, but I think it is reaction as well. Anyway, I can't. I wish we had more time. I'm afraid of becoming very boring.
Can't end on that note. Let's have a look. There's somebody else down there in the aisle.
Hello. I've read quite a lot of your books when I was younger, after discovering Warlord of the Air in the school library, which was fantastic. And then, I was wondering, what was it like to write and spend a lot of time in the head of the Colonel Pyatt character? Because I find him quite difficult to be around.
I did too. Colonel
I say Piat. It's a Russian, just Russian for 5. Initially, those books were my attempt to deal with the Holocaust in my own, for my own sake as well as in general. And it was very hard because he's a total bigot. He's an appalling character, but they're also. I mean, I think I was also trying to write a comedy, so they're also. He's also a comic character. It was very hard. I thought initially I was going to finish the 4 books in the series, which go from 1900 to 1977, I think. I thought I was going to do it in maybe 3 or 4 years, and in fact it took me a good well over 20 years to do. It's about 1 million words. It's very long. It ends more or less with Dachau. I had to keep breaking between the books to write something, either a comedy or something at least lighter, because otherwise I think I'd have gone mad. The amount of research I was having to do, the subjects that I was having to examine were so horrible that I don't think I could have done it as I'd planned, just do it all the way through in a few years. So I wrote the first one, I think, was published in 1986, I think, and the last one was published in 2012. So yeah, it's over 20 years it took to write, with some sort of gasping between, just having to get some fresh air every so often. I really admire anybody who finished it, who has read the whole thing. Quite a lot of people have, surprisingly, but I'm not sure I would have or could have. It's just, I mean, because it's confronting. It's confronting, well, ourselves all the time, as well as the so-called bad guys. In fact, the intention of the book was to show how we all as nations conspired in the rise of Nazism, and the kind of mood and ideas that were going on in America with the Ku Klux Klan and stuff like that, and in the Middle East, just dealing with anti-Semitism in pretty much all of its forms, or all of its forms that I knew then.
One in the middle here.
Sorry, yeah.
There's so much of your work that revolves around London, and I find it inspiring that my city is the centre of the multiverse. What is it that you found so inspiring about London, and are you attempted to write about Paris?
I have written about Paris. I've written about Paris a fair bit. Again, in the Piat books, I think the second volume is set quite a lot in Paris. But of course, I'm a Londoner first and foremost. To me, cities are more interesting. There are more stories in cities, or at least I think there are more stories in cities. I find more stories in cities. I remember I was living in the country for about, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I was exiled from London, and I realized after I'd been there 3 years, I was starting to think in terms of writing, interesting little cameos about country life, and I thought, Jesus, I've really got to get out of here. And within about a week after that, we were heading back to London, not with any great prospects at the time, but it was better to be in the city in a tiny flat than it was to be in a huge house in Yorkshire. Although I have nothing against Yorkshire, I love Yorkshire. My family comes from Yorkshire, at least half of my family comes from Yorkshire. But Paris, yes, I am writing quite a bit about Paris. But I don't know Paris in the same way. I mean, I wasn't born here. And it would be, I think, in a way impertinent to write certain subjects about somewhere where I wasn't really steeped completely in the city, although I've been coming here since I was 15. as explained by my superb French.
I'm aware we've run out of time, so I'd just like to say thank you so much, Mike, for the books and the conversation.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks. Well, can I add that this is not flattery, but I really find Harry's books some of the best modern fiction that I've read, and is well worth a read. I'm sorry, I wanted to talk.
That is flattery. That's the definition.
Well, all right,
of flattery.
But I wanted to talk a bit about your books, and I'm sorry I haven't. But start
a return match. I'm sure.
Yes, we can. Yes. We'll be back next week.
Same time, same place next year. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yes.
And I would like to add that we in fact have stacks of Michael's books and Harry's books, which were literally flying off the shelves at the beginning of this reading, available at the front. I imagine both Michael and Harry would be happy to sign them for you. Please do stick around. We'll be serving glasses of wine, continue the conversation with Michael, with Harry, with each other. And please join me one more time in thanking Michael Moorcock and Harry Kunzru.
Thank you. Thanks.